Imagine this for a second. No machines, no electricity, no Google Maps, no cranes, no concrete trucks. And yet a medieval king points at an empty hill and says, "Build me something that will stand for 500 years. And somehow, impossibly, they do it, because medieval kings didn't just rule from thrones. They literally carved their power out of raw earth. And if you think castles magically appeared, you're about to realize how wrong that assumption is. Because the real story is darker, smarter, and far more brutal than schoolbooks ever told you. And it starts not with stone walls, but with fear. Fear of invasion, fear of rebellion, fear of being forgotten. Because a castle was not a home first, it was a message, a warning written in stone that said, "I am here, I am watching, and I am not going anywhere." So the king's first move wasn't building walls, it was choosing the land, because one wrong hill meant death, and scouts would spend weeks studying wind, water, sunlight, and enemy paths, asking questions like, can an army surround this? Can they starve us? Can we see them coming days before they arrive? And once the land was chosen, the real nightmare began, because the king didn't hire builders the way we think today. He commanded labor. Thousands of peasants pulled from farms, men who had never touched stone before, suddenly ordered to reshape mountains with hand tools. And here's the twist most people miss. These workers weren't slaves, they were taxpayers, paid in obligation, not coins. And if they refused, they lost land, protection, sometimes their lives. And while we imagine castles rising gracefully, the truth is, the first years looked like chaos. Mud pits, broken backs, crushed fingers, people dying just to dig foundations deep enough so walls wouldn't collapse in winter. And the king watched all of it, because a castle failing wasn't just embarrassment, it was political suicide. And then comes the part that shocks modern viewers. The castle wasn't built top to bottom. It grew like a living organism, starting with a wooden fortress called a motte and bailey, because speed mattered more than beauty, and kings needed something defensible now, not in 30 years, and only later did stone slowly replace wood, block by block, decade by decade, sometimes across generations, meaning the king who ordered it would die before ever seeing it finished. Which raises a haunting question: why build something you'll never live in? Because castles weren't about comfort, they were about legacy, control, and psychological warfare. Every tower designed to intimidate, every narrow stair twisted clockwise so right-handed attackers couldn't swing swords properly, every window angled for archers, every gate layered with traps meant to exhaust, confuse, and terrify invaders before they even reached the courtyard. And here's another twist. Castles were not peaceful places. Inside those walls were politics, betrayal, starvation during sieges, children raised knowing they might watch people die below their windows. And kings understood something we forget today. Power must be visible, permanent, and painful to challenge. So castles were intentionally expensive, intentionally difficult, because the harder they were to build, the harder they were to destroy. And then comes the reveal that changes how you see everything. Medieval kings weren't primitive builders stumbling through trial and error. They were strategic system thinkers, running medieval megaprojects with logistics, supply chains, workforce rotation, quarry management, and time planning that rivals modern construction, all without modern math, blueprints, or machines. And the final payoff is this: castles weren't just buildings, they were frozen decisions. Every stone a choice made under pressure, fear, ambition, and survival. And the reason many still stand today while modern buildings crumble isn't luck or magic. It's because medieval kings didn't build for profit or speed. They built for eternity. And once you understand that, you realize castles aren't relics of the past. They are warnings from history above. What humans can build when power, patience, and purpose collide. Part 2. And now, here's where the story gets even more unsettling. Because once the walls were standing, the castle's real purpose slowly revealed itself. And it wasn't glory or romance, it was control. Because medieval kings quickly learned that stone alone doesn't rule people. Systems do. So castles became machines designed to dominate both enemies and their own population. And here's the twist most people never think about. The castle wasn't built to protect villagers, it was built to watch them, tax them, and if needed, crush them. Because from the tallest tower, the king's men could see farms, roads, rivers, and trade routes, meaning every sack of grain, every merchant cart, every movement belonged to the crown. And suddenly, that beautiful fortress becomes something colder, something calculating, because castles collected food during peace, not for comfort, but for siege math. How many mouths, how many months, how long before desperation turns into surrender? And when war came, the castle didn't fight bravely, it waited, because starvation was cheaper than battle, and here's where the human cost explodes. Because while kings waited safely behind stone, villages outside were burned deliberately so invading armies couldn't steal supplies, meaning innocent people paid the price for strategic patience. And inside the walls life wasn't heroic either. Space was cramped, air was foul, disease spread fast, and the smell of waste never truly left. Yet kings accepted this misery because the castle worked. Rebellions failed, invasions stalled, enemies broke themselves against walls that refused to rush. And then comes another chilling realization. Castles trained fear into memory. Generations grew up knowing that no matter how angry they became, that stone monster on the hill would outlive them. And that's when castles stopped being defenses and became symbols, because even unfinished towers sent a message. Resistance is temporary, power is permanent. And here's the final reveal of part 2. The reason castles changed history isn't because they were unbeatable, many eventually fell, but because they reshaped how humans thought about power, territory, and time, teaching kings that true dominance isn't fast or flashy, it's slow, heavy, and patient. And once that idea was set in stone, literally the world was never the same again. Part 3. But the story doesn't end with stone and fear, because every castle carried a hidden weakness that kings tried desperately to outthink. And that weakness was time itself, because the moment a castle was finished, warfare began evolving to destroy it. And here's the twist. Castles forced humans to invent smarter ways to kill buildings, not people. So siege engines became science, not chaos. Trebuchets calculated angles and weight with terrifying precision. Miners dug silent tunnels under walls, hoping to collapse centuries of work in one heartbeat. And suddenly Stells that once felt immortal started to feel vulnerable, which terrified kings, because their greatest symbol of power could now be reduced to rubble by patience and math. And that's why castles kept changing. Walls grew thicker, towers became round instead of square, gates turned into deadly funnels of murder holes, boiling oil and falling stone. Because castles weren't static monuments, they were constantly upgrading survival machines. And here's the emotional punch. Every upgrade meant more labor, more taxes, more suffering for people who would never live inside those walls. And yet kings pushed forward, because abandoning a castle meant abandoning authority. And then comes the moment most people never consider. Cannons arrived, and with them, the slow death of the castle, because gunpowder didn't care about height or intimidation, it cared about impact, and walls that once laughed at arrows cracked under iron balls, forcing kings to make a brutal decision, adapt or become irrelevant. So castles transformed into low, thick fortresses, losing their towering dominance. And with that change, something symbolic died too, because power was no longer vertical, watching from above. It became centralized, bureaucratic, distant. And here's the final payoff. The reason castles feel magical today is because they represent the last time power was physical, visible, and brutally honest, where you could point to a hill and say that stone controls my life. And once castles faded, power didn't disappear, it just became invisible, living in laws, systems, borders, and institutions instead of walls. And that's the real legacy medieval kings left behind. Not ruins for tourists, but a blueprint for how humans build control, adapt to threats, and trade visible strength for invisible dominance. And once you see that, you'll never look at a castle, or modern power, the same way again. Part 4. And now comes the part no one warns you about. Because castles didn't just shape kingdoms, they reshaped the kings themselves, slowly trapping them inside the very structures they built for control. Because once a king moved into a castle, he could never truly leave it behind. And here's the twist. Castles made rulers paranoid, not powerful, because every corridor echoed, every stair hid blind spots, every servant could be a spy. And the thicker the walls became, the more isolated the king grew, cut off from real life, real people, real consequences, ruling through messengers and shadows instead of faces. And this isolation changed decisions, making kings harsher, colder, more suspicious. Because when your world is stone and silence, empathy doesn't survive long. And then there's the economic trap most people never notice. Castles were bottomless pits of money, constantly demanding repairs, garrisons, food storage, upgrades, and once a kingdom built too many of them, it began to bleed itself dry, forcing higher taxes, fueling resentment, planting the seeds of rebellion inside the very system meant to prevent it. And here's the emotional beat. Some kings realized too late that the castle had become a cage, because leaving it meant risking assassination, but staying inside meant losing touch with the world they ruled, and history is filled with rulers who were technically powerful but practically prisoners of their own defenses. And then comes the quiet collapse. Castles didn't fall dramatically most of the time. They were abandoned, stripped of stone, left to decay when maintaining them no longer made sense. And here's the final reveal of Part 4. The true downfall of castles wasn't cannons or enemies, it was cost, complexity, and changing human behavior. Because power no longer needed walls when it could move faster than armies, tax without presence, and rule without visibility. And that's why castles stand empty today, not as symbols of strength, but as monuments to a dangerous truth. Every system built for absolute control eventually controls its creator. And once you understand that, the castle stops being a ruin and becomes a warning carved in stone. And this is where everything comes full circle. Because if you think castles are just dead stones from a dead age, you're missing the most important lesson medieval kings accidentally left behind. And here's the twist. The castle never really disappeared, it just changed its shape because the logic that built castles still runs the modern world, only now the walls are invisible, the towers are digital, and the gates are controlled by systems instead of soldiers, and medieval kings understood something we pretend we've outgrown. Whoever controls access controls power, whether it's a drawbridge or a database, a gatehouse or an algorithm, and that's the uncomfortable realization. Because today we don't see power on hills, we carry it in pockets, live inside it, depend on it, and rarely question it. Just like medieval villagers rarely questioned the castle watching over their fields. And here's the emotional payoff. Castles feel romantic now because they no longer dominate us. But in their time they were terrifying, unavoidable, permanent. And that's exactly how modern power works when you stop noticing it. And the final reveal of this entire story is this. Medieval kings didn't just build castles to defend their kingdoms, they built the first physical versions of control systems that humans still replicate today. And the reason their ruins still pull us in isn't nostalgia, it's recognition. Because on some level we understand that those stones are mirrors, reflecting how power is built, protected, upgraded, and eventually abandoned. And once you see castles this way, they stop being history and become a warning about the future. And that's why this story matters, because the castles are gone, but the thinking that built them never left.